Good afternoon, everyone. I think I'll break the first rule of an internet conference and not treat it to a PowerPoint. So you'll have to work twice as hard to stay awake, I guess. I'm actually from Belarus, but I live in the US. So my interest in the subject of the internet was actually quite political. And my interest from the very beginning was trying to understand how new media and technology and the internet could actually open up closed societies and what we traditionally refer to as authoritarian states. So I'm still quite interested mostly in the closed and authoritarian aspects of the subject, but I guess we'll get into the democracies as well. So to structure my talk, I think I'll focus on three main actors in this new environment of online participation or cyber activism or whatever other label we want to stick on this. And those three actors are businesses, governments, and citizens. And they're all very tightly interconnected. And if you look at the sort of Western-Eastern divide and look at how Western companies like Google, like Facebook, are now being used in places like Iran or China, you also get a very dramatic sense of sort of geopolitics involved, because regulatory decisions taken in the Western context will essentially affect whoever uses those services for activism or participation in the East. So there is some kind of a common denominator, and I'm not yet sure what it is. So let's start with the first one, with businesses. And here again, I would like to break this category into two subcategories. The intermediaries and the service providers, which provide services to governments and others. So as for intermediaries, again, those are mostly companies like Google, like Facebook, like Twitter, and any other social networking or cloud computing site, which basically offers services which people can use to campaign, to organize some kind of online petition, to exert pressure on some political and media structures. Of course, we hear a lot about the way in which Facebook, and we heard about it this morning, how Facebook has been used in Egypt for planning protests, how Twitter was used in Iran, and those are all very positive signs. And of course, there is a lot to admire about the way in which the internet is helping many of these movements. But you also have to bear in mind that there is still a lot of uncertainty in trying to use these platforms for activism. And this uncertainty exists in part because the infrastructure which all of these activists and social movements have to use is still in private hands and more or less motivated by profit. So when you look at some of the decisions which, for example, Facebook has taken over the recent years, they, for example, refused to host a group and deleted a group which was dedicated to promoting secular education in Morocco, for example, right? Again, no one knows why. One day the administrator of that group wakes up and discovers that someone has deleted that group without any further explanation. He writes an email complaining to Facebook, and his own account gets deactivated as a result. And of course, the group with 1,000 members essentially disappears until there is a lot of noise in the international media and Facebook restores the group without giving any further explanation, right? So he was lucky, the guy who set up this group, but I can assure you that there are many others who were not as lucky and who have seen their work efforts and whatever social capital they built online disappear because of a decision taken somewhere in California, maybe by someone who has no idea about the political implications of what they're doing. The same project often arises when it comes to moderating content on sites like YouTube, which again offer a lot of visibility. You can, in Egypt, for example, a lot of bloggers have used YouTube to post videos of police brutality, where they have shot videos capturing, very brutal beatings by the police on their cell phones, and then someone in YouTube flags those videos as violent, right? Because they did not know the context in which those videos were shot. And if you look at them, they are violent, but all of the videos of human rights abuses tend to be violent by the very nature, right? So again, these intermediaries don't yet have in place a very good review process. And some of them are transparent about their review process, some of them aren't. YouTube and Google, they have went on record and actually explained how they go through, deciding which videos, which groups, which content can stay online and which can't. Facebook has been very silent on this issue, and they, it's not just this, secular group in Morocco, also activist groups in Hong Kong, and many others have been deleted. You all know, even, we don't have to look into authoritarian kind of context to see what, for example, Apple is doing with its store, right? You may have heard of this story of a very famous Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist who saw his own cartoons removed from Apple Store because supposedly they were indecent, right? And again, it just shows you that there is this new intermediary in our sort of public life, or in the case of people in places like Morocco, China, of activism, and there is still very little clarity as to what motivates their decisions. And I think the problem is that many of these companies also resist efforts to join efforts which would bind them to behave in some rational, ethical, and visible manner. So Facebook, for example, has resisted the pressure to join a global network initiative, which is this new initiative between uniting technology companies, which basically binds them to behaving in a certain way on issues of freedom of expression and privacy and several others. And you have these giant companies like Twitter, like Facebook, which just don't want to join, and they are playing this important geopolitical role. And what's most interesting is that the geopolitical role they're supposedly playing in Egypt and Iran and elsewhere, the facts, it kind of makes it very hard to regulate them on issues like privacy. You start talking to executives from Twitter about, and Facebook about improving privacy, about, making sure that the users' data is not being disclosed to third parties, and they say, well, you can't be regulating us. Look at us, we are spearheading a revolution in Iran or Egypt or elsewhere. So they very successfully actually playing off the positive PR and publicity that they generate internationally to resist any efforts to regulate themselves domestically. And if you look at Washington, there are very powerful pressure groups sitting in DC, which are concerned with democracy in Iran and elsewhere, and no one wants to fight those people. And Facebook and Twitter and others are very successfully playing off that case, that they are very important in American foreign policy, and any efforts to regulate them greatly may actually somehow slow down the efforts to democratize the rest of the world. The other sort of component of this businesses and corporations pillar that I've singled out is companies which have built a very profitable business of aggregating and data mining all this information posted to social networking sites and to the internet in general. And many of them do it with a commercial purpose in mind. They are they sell this information to businesses and to brands. So if you want to know how your brand is being discussed on Facebook or Twitter, of course, there will be thousands of services which will allow you to get access to that information. The problem is that the very same services can be used to track what is being said about dissent or human rights or democracy in China or any other sensitive subject. So essentially, there is a very strong business pressure to develop this data mining tools, which all sound very nice in theory, but then they can be used for very malevolent purposes. And there is virtually no regulation in this space. And it's not just authoritarian governments which are taking interest in such products. There is a very interesting venture, I would say, in the US called InQtel, and it's basically a venture capital fund of the CIA, and it's very publicly disclosed. You can go look at their website, they're not hiding it. They, for example, recently invested in a company called Visible Technologies, which basically data mines Twitter and looks for trends and tries to see if there are some emerging and breaking stories which may not yet be covered in mainstream media. So whenever there is an earthquake happening somewhere and people already start tweeting, they will learn about it faster because they have this excellent new technology to basically study trends in social media. And you can only think about how many services like this, an authoritarian government like China can use. And what you also have to understand is that if you look beyond sort of the Western Europe and North America, in places like Russia or China or even Iran, a lot of these web services are dominated by local companies, and those local companies have even fewer, social and political responsibilities. So when the Chinese government demands a local Chinese company to give them user data, they will be, they'll make much less of a fuss than Google or Facebook will, right? So, and again, it's not yet clear how the geopolitical angle of supposedly Iranian government saying that Twitter is used by CIA to foment a revolution in Iran, how that eventually plays and has an impact on the number of local Twitter users in Iran, right? As long as these services are perceived as political, there is a very high probability that the users will actually find themselves on safer local sites, safer, in quotation marks, and they would not be safer at all because local companies would be much more likely to compromise when it comes to user security than others. And this entire field of data mining is and it's all of this data is open, right? It's all posted by the users themselves. It sounds very scary, particularly when you think again about how it can be used against people participating in such campaigns in in authoritarian countries. Now there was an interesting article in the Washington Post a few months ago, which basically showed how now hotels are beginning to triangulate the information posted on various hotel review sites online with, if someone posted under the real name, they look up the dates and they look up the name and the customer database of the hotel and they try to match it to the review. And if it's a good review, they get a voucher allowing them an extra night. And if it's a bad hotel, if it's a bad review, sometimes the hotel reaches out and says, well, what didn't you enjoy? We may want to extend your stay, whatever, but sometimes they add it to the blacklist, right? And again, as long as there is a demand from, the corporate sector, you can be assured that, the same technology would then be used by, the Chinese or Russian or Iranian government to triangulate what people are saying about its services, rather than hotels. On sort of slowly moving on to the second pillar, which is governments, again, as I've already alluded to, there is quite a lot of new information which informs how the government reacts to the things which are happening in this country, right? So, and you can do it, on a macro level where you can basically study trends, right? It's very easy now with the amount of information posted to blogs and social networking sites, Twitter, and other platforms, to get a much clearer picture of the kind of moods and political moods especially which are dominating your country, right? So you can easily study reaction to new laws, new degrees, whatever. All of that can be done very easily, and it is done. But there is also a lot of surveillance and spying happening on individual activists. And very often it's taken more and more sophisticated forms. If in the past, someone would try to hack into your computer or hack into your email, now, because there are so many intermediaries involved, governments are beginning to penetrate the intermediaries and that way penetrate your computer. There was a very disturbing story in Vietnam a few months ago when basically a local group of activists simply downloaded software from a trusted website of a Vietnamese oppositional group abroad, which allowed them to type in Vietnamese. It was the kind of software which made it easy to type on an English keyboard. And what basically happened is that someone from the government infiltrated that website and replaced the usual file which had that software with a file that looked just like that but also had spyware in it. So basically people were downloading software which looked very innocent. It was just a software which would allow you to type in Vietnamese from a trusted website, and were also installing spyware on their computers. So the government more or less knew everything that those activists were doing for the past 3 or 6 months. And again, it's very hard to suspect anything because you have not, it's not like you visited a foreign site or some pirated website, right? You just visited a website which you have been visiting for the last, 6 months. So again, the fact that there are more intermediaries involved and that there is trust in this process also makes it somewhat easy to manipulate it. And it just so happens that many NGOs are not the most sophisticated users of technology, so it's not so hard to penetrate the websites and thus infiltrate essentially the entire oppositional community of a country. Beyond that, you also see governments beginning to get involved with manipulating content. Again, we heard about some of this morning, about China's 50 Cent Party, about efforts in countries like Nigeria to go online and post supposedly pro-government messages. You also see government agents or people who are affiliated or just feel very loyalist to the government actually go and, for example, manipulate these discussions in ways that can split the movement, whether it's an opposition movement, whether it's a campaign which is trying to coalesce public support on some cause. Again, we've seen that in Iran after the big protest there last year. What happened is that someone started posting videos which basically showed protesters supposedly burning the portrait of Khomeini, right? And it looked as if those were the usual oppositional protests, but they were burning the portrait of the Grand Ayatollah, which of course would be unthinkable and would cause a lot of splits in the movement. And that clip spread like fire through the Iranian blogosphere and through the foreign blogospheres, and then people eventually started noticing that it was just a montage. So someone actually took the shots of people who were protesting in the streets and just very carefully and professionally imposed the burning portrait on it, right? And again, you may eventually discover that this happened, but there are a lot of time-sensitive events and campaigns where if you discover it one day later, it wouldn't basically be of much help because you would lose the momentum that you needed to have at that very time. And this, of course, is not very pleasant. But to sort of stay on the run and to give you another example of what the government is learning about all of its online opponents who are using Twitter and Facebook and other sites to campaign, consider that a lot of Iranian Americans who actually do go back to Iran are now supposedly being asked at the airport right when they enter, the passport control, whether they have Facebook accounts, right? And if they say no, people at the passport control actually Google their names, and and if they do discover their Facebook account, they actually write down their names and see who else they are connected to, right? And this is very disturbing. And again, it's happening not just in Iran. I've had a few examples from Belarus, for example, the country where I come from, where what happens is that the government security service, which is still called KGB, actually goes through the profiles of the opposition leaders on social networking sites and see who they are connected to. And once they find names that are not already in their database, they look up those names and invite them for interviews and whatever other euphemisms you want to insert here. So again, the fact that there are more and more connections which are being established also makes it easier for the government to basically track what's going on. And very often it's invisible, right? And very often people do not realize that there is a great value in knowing who's connected to whom, right? Beyond that, I would also like to I think I'll move to the citizens part. And here, again, there are several layers. There are sort of the activists who are doing everything, and participants who are doing everything they are supposed to be doing. They're sending plenty of messages. They are, doing a lot of tweets. They are very active. The problem is that not all, causes are, not all causes benefit from a decentralized structure, from decentralized organizational structure. And I think, again, we have seen that in Iran, where there was an extremely vibrant online movement of people who were very active online, who were very active on Twitter, which essentially could not pull itself together when the critical moment for acting came, right? And again, that's, I think, is a problem, because it's very easy to lose sight of leaders in this environment when, by decreasing communication costs, you more or less are inviting more and more messages, right? And the more messages you have, the harder it is often to keep the organized structure, right? And again, for some campaigns, this may actually be perfect when all you need is just to distribute news about a certain event. The decentralized structure is exactly what you need, because it defies censorship. When you are trying to get people into the streets or to show up at a certain moment at a certain time, and when you do need to make strong decisions, you probably need a centralized structure, right? And here again, it's nothing new. It's all in sort of revolutionary theory, which has been with us for a century. So again, it's not at all clear that more is better, right? In this case. But also, what we are beginning to see is that a lot of non-state actors who also happen to be non-democratic actors are very active consumers of this space. I'm fascinated by the case of Russia, where somehow it happens that it's the nationalist movement which is much more active actor in the online space than the liberal opposition. And just to give you an example, you have, for example, there is kind of a movement in Russia called Movement Against Illegal Immigration, which is an extremely right-wing nationalist movement. They have been doing fascinating things online. 4 years ago, when people were not yet so hot about mashups, they were already taking census data and mashing it up with maps of Russian cities to show where ethnic minorities live, and thus then encourage their supporters to keep an eye on those neighborhoods, right? And again, they have been extremely successful at, mobile. You look at their website, for a nationalist movement, they are pretty cosmopolitan. You can translate, their website into 5 languages automatically. You can buy stuff from their online shop, and they are extremely good at, deploying all of the mashups and petitions and all of this other fancy stuff we're talking about. And what's more interesting is that the government is not often unhappy. So in some case, they are strengthening many of the policies of the government when it comes to certain minorities, when it comes to suppressing the liberal opposition. There are actually very nice alliances between this new digital movement and the state. So analyzing state-society relations here could be very tricky because it's just a very diverse society, right? It's not just pro-democratic forces which are pushing for more, democratic participation. While we're on this sort of subject of nationalists, I would also like to point out that you have to consider that a lot of materials which were previously inaccessible to a lot of people, like all sorts of conspiracy theory books which offer competing narrative of the nation's history, for example, or a competing narrative on some historical event. In Ukraine, for example, there is this great debate happening for almost now 7 decades about whether the Ukrainian hunger in the 30s could be called a genocide, right? And there are a lot of Russian nationalists who denied that, and Russian citizens in general, a lot of Ukrainian nationalists who basically argued that yes, it was a genocide. Suddenly now you have both movements suddenly digitize all sorts of weird books which were published in the last 7 decades on each subject and displayed very prominently on their website, and those are being used as recruitment tools to sort of, argue either way and to attract more people into their movement. So you do see more contention, you do see more competing narratives. Often those narratives work against, democratization or, pluralism or any of the other values we sort of may want to promote. Again, I tend to be less optimistic than many of my colleagues on the subject, but it's not because of what you see or what I see in the internet. It's more or less what you see in the society and sort of what are the kind of forces which the internet may enable. And here we actually, I very much like your last slide about, whether we actually want to have, whether it's actually possible to have an open government. And I think there is a certain dynamic which the internet promotes, which may actually force us to rethink how our own democratic regimes work and what role information actually plays in them. I'm not at all convinced that a fully transparent society would actually allow us to keep having the kind of representative democracies that we have. It may be a shift to a direct democracy. I'm not sure that that shift would necessarily be a healthy one. To sort of to end on another quote, which I think was a predecessor to your quote, when Bismarck said in 1870, I think, that just like sausage, you don't want to see how your laws are made. I think that there is some truth to that, right? I mean, there are certain facets of public life and political life which may, if opened, result in greater cynicism, less participation, or participation which will not be conducive to democracy. So, by no means do I have, coherent answers to, or, predictions, which, I'm sure of, but I think it is healthy for us to start having a debate about the role that information, or lack thereof, actually plays in well-functioning democratic societies. So I think I'll stop here and we can have some time for debate.
Thank you very much. Doncs ara us toca a vosaltres si preguntes, qüestions. Ana Sofia, sisplau.
Ponent. Per l'Albert, que m'ha quedat la idea aquesta que hi ha una enquesta feta per la Pisonyer, és així, i volia saber una mica més que és una mica les característiques d'aquesta enquesta, i la gent que la respon, qui és l'objecte, qui són els que responen i quin és l'objecte d'aquesta enquesta, una mica més descriptivament. I per al professor, com es diu, Morozov, I can ask you the question.
Sure.
I'm interested in knowing why do the nationalist party or movement is more present online than, for example, the liberals. I mean, why do you think they have more incentives to be online? Thanks.
L'enquesta va ser dissenyada per la Fundació Pi i Sunyer i va ser distribuïda a tots els ajuntaments de més de 10.000 habitants, exceptuant Barcelona. Això feia tant com 112 ciutats, de les quals en sorgien fins al 2007 507 projectes de participació ciutadana impulsats per aquests 112 ajuntaments. Va haver-hi una ràtio de resposta del 81%, responien els responsables de l'Ajuntament designats per l'Ajuntament, per cada Ajuntament, de noves tecnologies o participació, diferents personatges, i allò que s'ha fet és l'explotació concreta, estadística, d'aquelles preguntes que tenien a veure amb l'ús de les tecnologies en els processos de participació ciutadana, no amb altres preguntes. Si vols més dades, ne tinc, però ara mateix no.
Well, the short answer, I guess, would be that hate travels better than hope online, and it just happens that it is much easier to go and collect information from 50,000 profiles of foreigners studying at Moscow universities than to come up with a meaningful 3-minute video which will point out deficiencies in Putin's and Medvedev's conception of sovereign democracy. But I don't think it's I think it's not so much about the internet as it is about social and political factors which just enable nationalism, and it's not even nationalism, it's more xenophobia than nationalism. You do have a problem with nationalism in non-Russian parts of the Russian Federation. You have nations which essentially have been split artificially into 5, like the Circassians, for example, in the Caucasus, and now after they have lived under 5 artificial groupings for 70 years, they are becoming to rediscover the national identity. So you have all sorts of movements and pushes towards greater assertion of the national identity. And if you look at a huge country like Russia, it's not at all clear that it will still be in its geographical shape, to me at least, 20 or 25 years down the road, because it has more or less been built on creating a lot of national myths, which now are very easy to poke holes in with all the information online, and it has been built on suppressing competing narratives, which now are also emerging online. So and I'm not sure that it's not just Russia, it's China as well, and you saw that last year with, Uyghurs and Huns in China, where, there is still a big sort of unresolved question of nationalism, and a lot of ethnic groups which are pushing for, more independence, or, they are discovering that they actually are completely separate groups, and whatever they have been told for the last 5 decades wasn't really true. So I'm not at all sure where this age of contention will actually end. I'm not very optimistic, at least on the question of Russia.
I would like to repeat a question I've made this morning to Karin Dutch-Kakler about data heavens.
Yes.
So on the one hand, it looks like it's a good idea to protect activists and people that should be sort of protected from these evil governments and even nationalists.
Yes.
But your opinion, please.
I don't know if everyone was there. I mean, you think everyone knows what the question is?
I think so.
Okay.
Okay. In any case, si alguien no estaba aquí esta mañana, resumo un poco la pregunta y era sobre el tema de Wikileaks, donde se rompieron varias protecciones online para poder desencriptar información del Departamento de Estado americano, y cuando el Departamento de Estado americano fue a perseguir a Wikileaks se ha refugiado en Islandia bajo una especie de santuario de datos, en teoría bajo la bandera de la libertad, aunque algunos sospechan que a lo mejor se ha pasado un poco de la raya, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta es, ¿tiene que haber un santuario de datos para que haya libertad de expresión? ¿O ese santuario de datos acaba siendo como las Islas de Caimán, es el santuario financiero?
Well, I think, first of all, there are two different kind of data heavens, or, privacy heavens, or whatever you want to call it, right? Anonymity heavens. I mean, yes, there are tools like Tor, which do provide some anonymity and which do provide some privacy. Well, they don't provide much privacy, but they do provide anonymity, and they do allow you to access content which may not be accessible in your country. I think on that question of censorship circumvention tools, the answer is easy. There is nothing for governments and Western governments to do in funding those groups. I don't think that the American government should be funding Tor or any other tools, simply because those groups are often used by terrorists and groups which more or less undermine the rule of law. It doesn't, on the other hand, mean that those groups cannot be supported by private foundations, individuals, or supporters, or whoever else, right? Sure, they can incorporate somewhere, and I think more or less, from a practical viewpoint, there is no way you will prevent Al-Qaeda or terrorists from devising a secure technology which they would be able to use. However, I think it just makes Western governments and the U.S. specifically look very duplicitous when, on the one hand, they want to promote anonymity online, and on the other hand, they actually go and arrest, I don't know if you've heard that story, but, when was it, in March, I think, or it was maybe last year, when there was a G20 meeting in Pittsburgh, the American police, New York Police Department actually, tracked down an American activist on Twitter who was, posting news and updates from the demonstrations, because supposedly he was helping protesters to evade the police. So when you have American police arresting, people tweeting in America, what can we expect from the Iranian or Chinese police, who essentially did the same after, the Twitter revolution in Iran, right? But I think there is a lot of value in tools like Tor, and I think, I'm not so much worried, as I said, for Al-Qaeda, they'll find their own tools. I'm worried about activists in places like Russia or China or Iran who would not fund their own tools. So for those, I think, yes, there are a lot of foundations who can do that. On the question of WikiLeaks, I'm kind of more torn because, if Iceland wants to host them, again, I also think that there is very little that can be done to prevent certain files, especially if it's a hot file, from being distributed online. Yes, I would want to do something. I'm just not sure how exactly that would be done, because this information will travel from a website to website. If it's hot, and the more you block it, the more it will travel. It's a phenomenon known, it's an issue known as the Streisand effect. I don't know how many of you have heard of this term before, but it basically originated 4 or 5 years ago when Barbara Streisand, was the actress and singer, was actually trying to sue a photographer who put photos of her summer house in Malibu online, and by suing him, she actually antagonized the internet to an extent that that house became one of the top Google image searches for the name Streisand, right? So, of course, the more you are trying to block, the more potentially, I think, attention you will draw. So you have to walk a tight line here. Again, I don't think that, the American government or, European government should be doing this. The Icelandic government will probably, get over its anger with Europe and everyone else in a year or two and kick WikiLeaks out. But, I think it's more driven by, European politics rather than by, anything else.
May I make a comment on your statement that there is no use or no need for Western governments to support tools like Tor and onion routing networks?
No, there is need. I just said they shouldn't be doing that. There is definitely, I'm sure that Tor needs a lot of money. I'm just saying that they shouldn't be funding them.
No, but I would want to reverse that statement, because a couple of years ago in Germany there was a lot of fuss about child pornographers using onion routing networks. And colleagues of mine in the Prime network, Prime project, are involved in developing these onion routing tools. And they approached the German law enforcement officials and they said, do you want us to take down these networks in order to make your life easier and find and stop child pornography? And German law enforcement said, no, don't do that. And it turns out that law enforcement officers are major users of the onion routing networks. So, so from that perspective, you could argue that governments should invest in these kind of tools. But apart from that, I think it's a basic. It's not a positive right, but anonymity is not a positive right. At least in most European countries, it isn't. But it is something that we should foster, and therefore, I would argue that indeed governments should allow for these kind of networks, and that may even include funding.
You have to understand that, you know, anonymity was the primary reason why Tor came into existence, but its side effect is the ability to circumvent censorship. And this is the ability to circumvent censorship which makes many people tricky, because you can also interpret it as basically, you know, disregard for the rule of law. So you cannot have, you know, the American government preach the, you know, the value of promoting the rule of law on the one hand and then distributing tools which circumvent it. You know, you can be pushing for reforming the laws, but I just don't think that, you know, providing that platform with one hand and with the other hand punishing everyone for, you know, not promoting the rule of law is a good idea.
But that applies to almost any technology. Take the postal services. I mean, the postal services were enacted in Britain so that Cromwell at the time could inspect the communication between citizens, because many a plot was launched by means of written communication. So it was a tool for a surveillance tool for the government at the time, but it's also a means for private communication. So, I mean, yeah, that applies to many technologies. Often it's two-sided. You can use things to the benefit, and you can use things to do harmful things.
Of course, but you know, all of those services you mentioned are still and were still regulated.
Yeah, sure. I'm not opposing regulation.
Sure.
I'd like to start off with your Bismarck quotation, which is, you don't want to see how your sausage is made. Well, I do. I want to know exactly what goes into it and how it's made. Okay. That's for starters.
Sure.
You're centering, or you've centered a lot of what you've said on business. In other words, that all these social networks are run by private businesses and that they are profit-oriented, which is absolutely true. But that doesn't mean that in the near future, social networks will not go in, you know, with open source software, that they won't be able to be developed in sort of public hands or in your own, with your own resources, so that activists or activist groups can develop their own social networks to be able to work on that. I mean, you know, there's a lot of open source software. So in the case of the Vietnamese typing tool, perhaps if that had been open source software, someone would have realized that it had been hacked. So, I mean, so there are a lot of buts to the arguments you've set out. Another one is that, as I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, Ronald mentions, technology can be used for positive or for negative, in positive or negative ways, so that, in fact, one concern of mine is, rather than centering our looks at what's happening in authoritarian countries, we ought to be more concerned about liberal democracies and what's happening in liberal democracies, because the governments, with the excuse of the terrorist threat, etc., are limiting our rights and are monitoring our community relationships in ways that I think we should be very worried about. So that rather than sort of making these negative arguments as to how badly things may go in authoritarian countries, I think we should also be looking at how we can make democracy more open, government more open, open data, etc., within our own free countries.
Sure. Look, on the subject of private businesses and open source software, yes, there are a lot of tools which can allow you to set up your own social network. The reason why activists don't use them is because they don't have the same kind of audience that Facebook does. And the only reason why activists use Facebook, Twitter, and other for-profit businesses is because they have the audience, and this is the primary use for those sites. It's to raise awareness and to attract eyeballs, right? And it just happens that private firms are the best at attracting eyeballs, right? So that argument, you know, there has been a lot of enthusiasm about building open source alternatives to Facebook, and there are already a few. None of them has achieved the prominence that Facebook did. With regards to, you know, open source software in the Vietnamese group, maybe, but that, you know, spyware was part of an archive and you downloaded an archive, and whether it was an open source or closed source doesn't really matter. But again, you don't have the kind of scale for many of those languages. You know, Vietnam is still a big country. You can look at, you know, a smaller country where you wouldn't have the community of open source developers, and that just happens that many of these countries are very small. You know, look at most small African nations. They just wouldn't have the community to vet, you know, that software. On the subject of, you know, sort of to Bismarck's remark, again, you know, you have to, again, I just have to explain where I'm coming to those issues. Sure, you need to know how contracts are being made. You have to know how a lot of, you know, government purchases and tenders are being made. All of that, you know, is fine. But there are many instances where data supposedly posted online misleads you and gives you a very wrong picture of what's happening. Larry Lassig wrote an interesting essay last year called Against Transparency, where he more or less argued along this line, saying that the fact that you see that a senator had lunch with you know, a businessman and then voted to support something that favored that businessman, and then that was posted to his website, you know, that he had that lunch and it's posted in his schedule, does not necessarily mean that, you know, he took a bribe or was somehow influenced, right? So again, I'm all for transparency as long as transparency comes with enough footnotes and does not mislead. Because if it does mislead, it can easily lead to cynicism, which will then decrease voter turnout, or will then actually empower, you know, Tea Parties and all sorts of other fringe movements, as is happening in the US. So, and on your last comment about the need to watch for what's happening in liberal democracies, you know, I would agree fully, you know, and yes, you know, we should be doing that. You know, I'm just, you know, I have my own little empire of authoritarianism, and, you know, that's a subject I sort of care about deeply, but I fully agree that a lot of behavior happening here actually, in, you know, in democratic and Western societies actually enables greater repression elsewhere, you know. So as I gave this example of a Twitter activist arrested in America, you know, what would we expect, you know, from others? So sure, you know, and I hope, you know, Western groups and activists and NGOs will, you know, take up that fight.
No hi ha més preguntes? Ningú s'atreveix? Bé, doncs, si voleu, ho deixem aquí i ara donem pas a la clausura que faran la Carme i després l'Agustí com a director dels estudis. Moltes gràcies.